panel is a museum panel looking at how the new publics shaping our new museums, moderated by Richard Armstrong. Please, you have the floor. Examining forces shaping museums, especially contemporary museums. Right? I know yesterday we spoke about the McDonald's kind of approach, or that copy-paste, but it'll be very fascinating to hear from you and, of course, your panelists. You have the floor, Richard.
Thank you. I'm Richard Armstrong. I'm the director of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and Foundation in New York. I feel very honored to be in your midst because I see thinking people who care deeply about the things that we care about, and I also see many of you proposing solutions to the things that bother all of us. I also want to salute our colleagues at the Department of Cultural and Tourism for this summit, and I hope, as I know the leadership does, that good solutions come from good questions. So now let me bring in four giant brains. Come on in. Suhanya Raphael, who's the director of M+ in Hong Kong. Aaron Sito, director of a new museum, Makan, in Jakarta. Kalaput, a great architect who will talk to us about architecture from LA and New York, and Madeline Grinstein, director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And I've asked each one of them to contextualize their expertise. Suhanya.
Well, nice to be here with you, Richard, and colleagues. I have to say that I'm working out of Hong Kong, putting together a new museum called M+, a wonderful, mysterious title for a museum, M+, and many people ask me, how did M+ arrive at this name? Sited on West Kowloon, over 40 hectares of reclaimed land, is a project called the West Kowloon Cultural District, building an ambitious suite of institutions, 17 eventually, of which I am one of the museums. And part of the formation of the district was a period of public consultation, 3 years, where a museum advisory group discussed with Hong Kong people what they wanted. And they wanted 4 museums. They wanted a museum of ink, a museum of design, a museum of contemporary art, and a museum for film and moving images. And the then museum advisory group, chaired by Victor Loh, who is now my museum chair, decided to advise the authority, because the West Kowloon district became an authority, which is an ordinance of the Hong Kong government, to say we make one big museum rather than 4 little ones. But they couldn't describe what this museum was going to be. It was going to encompass all of these various disciplines. And they kept describing it as a museum, but more than a museum. Mm-hmm. And so M+ became M Museum and More. Very emblematic. And now our discussion is about new publics, new audiences, and how they shape the museum. This is a fine example of how a period of public consultation with people of Hong Kong arrived at an institution that is more than a museum, more than a building. And what does that mean for us? Something that we explore all the time, because we are under construction, a very large museum, 65,000 square meters, and a museum of visual culture. Coming out of Hong Kong, a city that is immersed in film, in advertising, in neon, saturated visual cultural space out of Asia. So very nice for us to be building an institution that touches on unconventional, porous ideas of culture and visual culture in our time. Our place in Hong Kong shapes that story. Our stories are very important to be spoken about and claimed in a global world. So we are an international museum as much as we are local.
Thank you. By serendipity, we have the directors of 2 new museums in Southeast Asia. Aaron Sito, you can tell us about the new museum in Jakarta.
We're definitely not as big as M+. Museum Macan, which stands for the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Nusantara, And Nusantara is a Malay word which means archipelago. So it really is a way of describing a region of the world and using that word archipelago allows us to circumvent some of the conversations around the national identity. We're a private museum as well. So we were founded by a collector who had been collecting modern and contemporary art for over nearly 30 years. And he decided at some point that Indonesia is a massive country. It's the fourth most populous country, 265 million people. And it's a country where infrastructure is sometimes lacking, and there is a drive right now to build all types of civic infrastructure. It hadn't had until our museum came along, a modern contemporary art museum. So where we bring something completely different, not only to the city of Jakarta, but to the country itself. But I think what is really important is that we're a private museum, but we understand that we operate in the public sphere. That the conversations that in the West you might expect to be located within public discourse is being taken up by the private. In this case, has been taken up by the private sector. So that's, I think, a very, very different conversation to what is happening, perhaps, with our colleagues in other territories. The other thing about the Museum Foundation is that its main driver is around education. So yes, there is a collection of 800 works, but if we don't have education and if we don't encourage art appreciation, it's very difficult to unlock what's going on in those works. So the museum, actually before we even opened, we've only been open since November 2017, but one of the first things that I did when I came on board was to send out our museum educators into the schools to help build a context for the coming of the museum, looking at ways in which teachers and schools could think about the museum as some kind of partner in their work. So that's...
You know, there's an easy way to look at the five of us. These two represent two new institutions. Madeline and I represent two mature institutions, both about 60 years old. Tell us about your museum in Chicago.
Thanks. Indeed, our museum is 51 years old. It was founded in 1967. And it began as a Kunsthalle, a Swiss word which is for non-collecting institutions. And its very first exhibition was a performance. So it's interesting that 52 years on, live arts, as we saw this morning, is so critical to part of our cultural landscape. Since 1974, we began a collection, which, by the way, right now is sitting in Sao Paulo as part of an international partnership with MASPI. So from the very, very beginning, we were a museum of contemporary art, experimental art, and by which I mean that we don't just reflect art history, we actually produce it. We commission works of art as well as exhibit it, as well as archive it and catalog it. Many years on, we go by the mantra that we are artist-activated, audience-engaged, 50-50 in everything that we do. Now, back in 1974, if you walked into the Museum of Contemporary Art and saw Chris Burden lying up under a pane of glass and you didn't get it, we didn't care. But today, we better care, because this involvement of the audiences and what they demand and what they want, and the participation that they want to have in the interpretation of art has become very critical.
Yeah, we'll get back to that idea, I think, about expectations. Kulapat, tell us about what can architecture do to serve new audiences and new museums.
Thank you. Well, I always think of architect for museum as matchmaker for art and people. I'm there both for the new museums, design for the historical museum. So I'm a partner to help think about what a museum could do. And with new public come new expectations. So it allows us to think, what is a museum today? And how can we be more relevant and more engaged? And so, as many of you know, a museum starts as temple of culture. It is a very static, rather exclusive and isolated institution. And how that slowly moved from that to others. So I'm here to talk about my work, both for historic museum in terms of renovation, expansion, so to conceive new museum and how architecture play a part of that. I think it's very important for us to see that the museum as temple it slowly moved into two things. It moved into museum as a place and museum as a platform. Both have their own implications. It's not just the physical, but also the experience and the recognition of what a museum brand could do. I think that all is important to what we do. So, for example, in my case, I'm working on 2 current projects. I'm working on a big renovation of one of the wing at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So talking about really bring new energy, new life, fulfilling the expectation and beyond for the audience for a big museum like that. At the same time, starting with a new Kunsthalle, a new form of museum in the Philippines, in Manila, for the Ayala Foundation, who really want this to be the platform for energy that the country needs to bring everything together, from art to fashion to car, consumption, shopping, and all of that combined. So within that, the matchmaking aspect I'm looking at is, in a way, redefining the content, and the content's vice versa. So because of that, I think it's very interesting to see who are the audiences and what are expectations, and how that, as a team, as we all know, we work with architects and curators and directors. As a team, how can we project a new vision of what that place would be?
Good. So we see architects now as matchmakers.
I'm very good at that. Good lighting.
We have a simple question, really, which is how do new publics shape new museums? And I guess my subtext question would be, do they? Suhanya?
I think from our situation in Hong Kong, in Asia, and particularly in Hong Kong, you can see in relation to contemporary and modern and contemporary art, there's been a huge explosion of the markets. Interesting, the Art Basel Hong Kong has been incredibly influential, even though 5 years before that the art fair was established. We have seen the art market become almost second. It takes place, London and Hong Kong vie for this position behind New York. Yet within the space of a city like Hong Kong, which is a very cosmopolitan international city, the museum world around the market is still very nascent, hasn't been developed in the way that you see the balance in New York or London or Paris. So very conscious that there's a need there to think about value and how museums provide historical value, aesthetic value, social value, relational value for art, architecture, design, which is what we collect, and shape a story around understanding. And we need to make sure that that is expressed. So in many ways for us in M+, we are working very hard to ensure that expertise is acknowledged and valued. We are experts in the work that we do. We bring our expert knowledge of the region, of histories, and apply that in a very conventional museum sense. But at the same time, how we engage is very unconventional.
Let's come back to that word expertise in a minute, but what was your mantra, Madeline, for your
artist
museum?
Activated, audience engaged.
And tell us how that works exactly.
Again, where we, to agree with Suhanya, we are experts, and sometimes expertise is mistaken for elitism, which it is not. It is knowledge. And so we work with our expertise, but we release more and more our authority. So the way in which we communicate what we know is much more informal and much more of a two-way conversation and partnership. And so it's really as much about process as it is about content in the way that we engage our audiences. With regard to our audiences, with regard to what I'm very, very interested in particular, in two particular slices of demographics in my museum in particular, and in the United States, generally speaking. There is a slice that you've got to look at through the lens of race and therefore equality, especially in Chicago, which is the flashpoint as well as a flashlight for issues around race and equity. And that is playing itself against the background of a demographics nationally that will turn the nation into a majority country by, some people say, by 2024. So issues of diversity and equity and access become very, very critical to the way not only we program, but actually the way we staff, the structure of our board, our vendors, as well as our program. Because really what this is all about at the end of the day, we are all here to discuss how to be relevant. And the way to be relevant is to at least to greatly think about how to reflect your demographics and speak that language.
But Aaron, in your case, it's a collection of 800 objects, but aren't the majority of them made by well-known Western artists?
At least half of them might be.
Yeah.
But you know, one of the things that I find really interesting about working in a private museum with a collector who's been accumulating these things over a 30-year period is that we're at the moment in a process of transition in the collection. The collection is moving from being a private thing to having a public life. And I think so much of those conversations about access and that you were talking about really form the basis of a lot of our internal conversations around what to present, how to present it, how to interpret it. The collection is only, I would say, 50% non-Indonesian. So there is still that balance. We understand. I mean, we have a very particular view of our geography. So the reason why we use that word Nusantara rather than Indonesia is that we see ourselves as being part of the world, not necessarily separate from it. We see Jakarta as being part of other conversations that are happening within the Southeast Asian region, which are beginning to be better integrated to other conversations that are going on outside.
Kulapa, tell us about the museum in Manila.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think, again, this is a museum that has the focus to be that place that everyone wants to go. You know, I think when you look at how expansive our culture has become, we are competing for that 24 hours that we all have. Museum is competing with shopping malls, with cinema, with the phones. So no matter how much choice we have, so how can museum be that relevant place that people feel, so instead of competing with all of that, why don't we join them? Why don't museum provide all the things that I felt is relevant to people's process of thinking? And deep down as an architect, I'm very committed to the idea, how can architecture let people's life flourish? How can we help them? In a way, we're controlling them by putting walls and roofs and floors. But that should be allowing them to do that. So the museum in Manila, which is now code word Tempo, is to be that place. It's a conjunction of flexible rooms and galleries, pavilions, set in this beautiful tropical landscape, sitting on the river in Makati. So it is designed so anything from immersive experience like the Team Lab, or many others, or even wonderful shows that Madeline put in her show, for example, which you upload. Many things could happen, including even fashion show, even design, even performances. So that flexibility is part of the program. But the other part, for me, is quite important, is that how can we really create a sense of community that allow people to actually like one another? Like the empathy quality. Because if people make decision to go out from their house, they would rather love people rather than hate. So how can we bring, that's one of the power of architecture that we need to deploy in this time more than others. Because we actually have a position to create environment that people like one another, like a matchmaker. So because of that, it's not about us, it's not about the building, but what the building could do.
In my day, one of the big attributes of a museum was that it was irrelevant. And part of the charm of that is that you're not seeing the ordinary, you're seeing the extraordinary. And when I was a little child, I lived in a medium-sized city in the middle of the country, but I would go into that museum in Kansas City and look at a very large Buddha that really intrigued me, not knowing what it was. And I think there's something to be said also for the museum as a site for irrelevance. I think we used to call it, connection to continuity and perpetual beauty and all those kinds of attributes. I think sometimes I wonder when museums take it on themselves to become social centers if they're not dooming their own enterprise, because actually that's not our expertise, my opinion. Suhanya?
I would beg to differ. I would say that we're also responsive and commission work with artists and makers. And artists are unfettered. They are always breaking barriers and pushing the institution into less comfortable places instinctively. And that's a very good thing, and we need to be alive to that. But also going back to your comment about the architecture also embodying spirit of museums, especially as we build them. I have a very interesting architect that I'm working with, Herzog and Imura, to build M+, and a very radical piece of design for Hong Kong, which is a very, very vertical city where millions of people live very close to each other, and they have designed an emphatically horizontal building, very large platform with a thin blade to house an LED, 65 meters high by 110 meters across, a very, very large screen. And part of the relationship with the museum is that we know Hong Kong is a city of lights, a city of neon, a city of advertising, where there is a huge amount of visual noise on that scale. And our screen is there to commission artists to make work on that screen. And in fact, we see it as our first art space, gallery space that people will enter through, and in the nights, not during the day. So this sense of how audiences are working with a museum is becoming much less predictable, and that's a good thing.
True for you, Aaron, also?
I think so, and I think that I have very different audiences to other people. We're not faced with an aging population. We have a very young population. Most of my audience is millennial. They're also mostly women as well. So this poses particular challenges on how we think about what we do as well. I mean, I like this idea of empathy because that is actually one of the core principles of the foundation as well. That in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, crazy city like Jakarta, where people are coming from everywhere all the time, and we live in difficult times, that we need to be able to find ways for people to see themselves reflected in our program, so that they feel like that they're part of it. Museums have become, or at least our private museum has, we hope it to have an important civic function in that way. But we're also not afraid of doing things which are popular. It poses another challenge for us. So if education is important for us, well, we actually have to start thinking about ways to use those social platforms to deliver good education, not just to perpetuate narcissism, but to see to understand how we might be able to get into to spark something in the mind of a young person. Considering that Jakarta, it's very difficult to cross by a car. So people talk about being digitally native, but I think in cities like this where you have where your infrastructure is constrained, well, actually, your life is in this device, and the museum needs to find different ways to engage with those audiences.
True in Chicago too.
I love what you said. I don't think that to your point, I don't think that wonder and civic commitment are mutually exclusive at all. Yeah. In fact, right now, I think that museums have to commit themselves to art and civic life in equal terms. And what I mean by that is, and I love what you said, because I do think that one of the sort of greatest challenges to all of us right now is that we live in such a polarized environment, and that forging common social bonds is a mandate right now. And we believe in this common dimension so much that we built a space for it. We did a renovation into which we inserted into the heart, physically and therefore philosophically, of the museum, a space called the Commons, in which situations like this take place every day. Dialogues take place every day, performances, live arts, public programs. And because we believe deeply that dialogue is the conduit to community. What we need right now is the restoration of social bonds and community across the board, and we believe that so deeply, and we do believe that architecture can be destiny. So we undertook a renovation towards that end. We're also big on millennials, so I'd love to talk about that when we have a minute, because they are really interesting.
Give us the pitch.
Okay, so millennials are super interesting right now. And
who are they? What age is this?
They're about 30 right now. They're about 30 right now. And this is the really interesting thing, at least in the United States. They are about to receive the largest transfer of wealth from their baby boomer parents of any population in US history. So pretty soon, they're going to be a very influential public employee, employer, and philanthropist. So you have to pay attention, I think, worldwide to this particular generation. What do they care about? Well, they care about they want their personal values and your institutional values to Venn diagram 100%. When we went to work, we had our personal values, the institutional values were over here, and we knew that they were separate things, but today millennials really insist that our institutions and its values reflect their personal values. And that leads to a lot of interesting questions about programming and what we stand for.
And is that a kind of intellectual narcissism? Or?
No, I don't think so. I think that it comes from another really interesting place, which has to do with loops back into audience engagement. There's a sentence that very much stayed with me as I was studying this, and it comes actually from a First Nation and millennial protest culture, which is nothing about us without us. And that is something that we've got to think about very seriously in everything we undertake, which comes back to, yes, 21st century museum audiences are deeply influential because they want a say at the table. However, going back to what you said, if you do not deliver curatorial rigor with that, you will fail the very audience that wants to be at the table with you.
There's no question about that. I mean, I was just going to say that for us, the project is, yes, definitely, the demographic is a young audience. We're already working while waiting for the building to be ready. We're already a museum in the imagination of people, in us as well. And we know that the audience is young and they are hungry, they are serious, they are engaged. But at the same time, we also know that our integrity lies in that expertise, and curatorial integrity is an essential part of that delivery. And this is argued across all levels, internally, external stakeholders, whether it be government, funding, or our own internal curatorial arguments with the learning curators as well as collection curators. So that expertise is essential, and I think that is that balance that I was talking about, this idea of value that is core in new audience building in places like Hong Kong, which have huge transitory populations. We have the busiest airport. 70 million people come and go out of Hong Kong in a year. Within Hong Kong's immediate region, the Pearl River Delta, we have 35 million people who can come within 40 minutes train ride. The cruise ships, there's 80 million. Cruise liners are very big tourist traffic that stop over in Hong Kong, 80 million a year, and that's all within 3 minutes of M+ as an institution. So that kind of catchment coming into Hong Kong is unbelievable. And I think a lot about, well, who is our audience?
I think you're both talking about expectations of audience, which is a big topic. I also wanted to ask, why this big taste for the experiential?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is, again, as a place, right? I think people are looking for, like what you like Maroon mentioned, they want to see themselves in the experience. They don't want to be taught someone else's experience. It starts from, I mean, you go to a museum to be educated, to be inspired with someone's maybe knowledge or history. That still stands. I mean, I agree with you. I think, but the integrity of the museum must stand. But it doesn't mean that you can be friendly and more considerate to other people that might want to know about you. So I think within that sense, the experience is that glue that allows them to feel their own being within the space. Naturally learn about something they don't know and maybe got inspired by it. It's a very indirect osmosis process rather than a more directive, didactic experience that maybe more older museums try to do. Because like what you say, before that, the museum was not competing with the internet, with your phone, with many others. Before that, a museum was a few novel choices for people to want to learn about something else. Now, you don't actually have to leave your house to do that. You can actually do that out of your own bedroom. So if you make decision, again, I'm thinking that because I'm in the brick and mortar business as well. So if people make decision to dress up and go out in social context, we need to give them something to think about. We need to make them feel that they connect to a larger context of what the city gives. They want to learn about others. For example, to go against the project in Manila, the project that we're doing for the Met in New York is just renovation, but a big renovation of the Rockefeller Wing, which is where the arts of Americas, Oceanias, and Africas are installed, from the 1970s, which is, in a way, start from the Museum of Primitive Art that Nelson Rockefeller started within his own, and then move into the Met. So I think it's important to think about that because in that case, yes, I'm creating this beautiful, uplifting context or experience for people to kind of get encounter with the art. But I'm also very conscious that, like what Suhanya mentioned, a Chinese tourist could be seeing the African art for the first time within a New York museum context. So how is that means? It's no longer just a museum for New Yorkers to go to, not only for New Yorker students to go to. You have millions and millions of visitors from a variety of walks of life, all ages and all backgrounds, encountering art that they are not understand. So, of course, I want to upkeep the highest level of curatorial translation to the work, but also I'm also aware of someone who's not understanding that culture and see it for the first time. How can I create a sense of curiosity and a sense of respect and understanding? And then after that, if they're interested, they can go out and online and look more for details. So that's kind of, I think, going back to what I was saying, that museums start as a place, but it has moved to the platform. Because, I mean, not using the bad context, if you look at Apple as a brand, the Apple Store and the Apple universe, museum is an Apple Store. People go to see the merchandise, they have an understanding, but they go home and they read about it, they spend more time even thinking about the brand. That's a great success. So a museum experience should not stop only just going to the museum. It has to stay in the mind, and that's where the platform part kicks in. Yeah.
We used to call that the imagination.
Yes, we can rebrand that too, yes.
But I think you'd also be surprised about what millennial audiences are interested in. If I look at my audience, some of the things that we get the most comments about from are our timelines, our archives, the historical works. Because to be quite honest, this generation of new museum goers have never seen their history presented in this way. So that's important. I mean, I think that's a big distinction that we can't generalize what millennial audiences look like around the world either.
Right.
I would also chip in and say that my experience is that it's a very serious audience. It's not cynical. And that's very refreshing. Deeply interested to learn. Learning is valued very highly and is embedded in people, and that's fantastic. these are major opportunities for us as museums.
And sorry, just to add one other thing, I think that the type of experiential display doesn't necessarily have to go along the lines of a team lab display or an infinity room. So we saw that we recently did an exhibition with Li Mingwei, and just the fact that people could sit and contemplate and write a letter or engage with somebody else was completely transformative. That was also a very, very popular exhibition that we had.
It's also worth mentioning that our commitment to experiential art is also a reflection of, I mean, we follow the artist. I mean, if we can't live without them, and the artist is, in fact, to state the obvious, central to everything we do, and multidisciplinarity and experientiality is very, very much a part and parcel of what artists are, of their toolbox, and we're here to catalyze that, reflect that, enhance it, elevate it, and translate it.
All right, you sold me. 9 minutes, 28 seconds. There must be a few questions. Here are a few.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of questions.
Lots of questions.
Thank you.
Is this on?
Yeah, this is on. Yeah, keep
Okay,
it close.
fantastic. So some of the language and the terms that I'm hearing more and more frequently from the panelists and museum directors across the board are, we are for you, we are here to serve you, we play a public function, we want to be a part of the public, we belong to you. So on that note, are there ways for the public to play a more active role in crafting the programming? And on one extreme, might that look like crowdsourced exhibitions? And in that dynamic, what are some of the opportunities and dangers as it relates to the shared authority and the expertise?
Well, we are, this is on an arc of involvement, and we are actually undertaking an experiment as we speak, where with regard to exhibition organization, you know, the typical arc of an exhibition is that a curator works for 3 years on something very, very deeply. The exhibition opens up, then there's public programming, and the catalog comes out. We are actually going to flip the model and do the public programming 3 years out. So the topic is identified, but then we're actually going to have those experts, the authors that eventually are catalog writers, in the commons with our public, and also invited stakeholders that have relationships either to that movement or that topic, and get that information up front, so that it can then inform the exhibition, and so that when the exhibition opens, actually, you may already have a community of loyalists who have heard about and even informed the quality of the information.
But I think Brendan's talking about something that's even more radical. Crowdsourcing an exhibition.
Yeah, not interested.
No, I think it goes back to that question of curatorial and intellectual integrity and knowledge, you know, valuing expertise. And that is an essential part of the relationship, that we continue to adhere to that, because these are we are supporting that research, long-term research across institutions and areas of expertise.
All right, he's out of luck. Who's next?
Recently, we hear that a scandal, I'm sure a big part of us, about a Sackler family and the funding, and how the performance of Nan Goldin show a very powerful public demanding correction about corruption. So now that I have the honor to have traditional museums and new museums coming out, I would like to know, because many museums follow the example of Tate Gallery refusing the funds of Sackler family and what it costs in many of the museums, that there are other museums that come from other countries that are unfortunately doesn't have the same ethical responsibilities. They don't take the same ethical responsibilities in order to address the funds and the society in itself, so very corrupt societies, unfortunately, that doesn't change that a lot. So how the traditional museums see this financial, let's say, disorder yet in other institutions, how you will put some order in or filter the funds that comes to support the exhibitions and any program of the museums, two societies versus one to another, news and old.
I don't know the answer, but I'll say this. We at the Guggenheim faced a particular challenge with the donor, and we tried to be fair both to the donor and to the larger public, and we did what we thought we had to do after a long discussion with trustees and staff. I want to caution you, though, against making an ethical template for every donation, because I don't know if you've ever been to the Frick Museum in New York, for example. He was a complete bastard. And I know because I used to live in Pittsburgh. I'm afraid if we start asking, is the virtuous person the donor of high culture, we'll all suffer hugely. That would be my easy answer, but there is no easy answer. And I think what you're really saying at bottom is, can the arts and can culture help people become more ethical? And that I think we can do. I'm sorry to be evasive, but other people may have a different answer.
We've got a question.
All right.
Thank you for your time and enlightening us. My question actually was, if you look at various business models and everything, anything other than museums, if you look at business models, most of the biggest companies these days are completely new business models. They've innovated where they needed to. And my question specifically is, has anybody done or began looking at museums and understanding how they can innovate in the business model with the intention of making them profitable?
I'll say something. I don't know much about our tax code, but for example, we really couldn't be profitable per se, but my predecessor, Tom Krenz, had the idea of the Guggenheim being a multi-sided operation, let's say. And that's partly why I'm here today, because we've made a collaborative arrangement with our friends here in Abu Dhabi, and we're hopeful of having Guggenheim Abu Dhabi on this site shortly, nearby here. But to me, that 12-year-old project is the beginning of another kind of model. Not every museum can follow that, but that might be one way. In the States, because of our taxes, we live on invested money from donations, and that's not always a model that translates to Europe or even to Asia.
I'd like to add some thoughts on that, because sustainability is a very important issue for all of us. But the idea of profit making is also, we need to unpack that. And it's again coming back to value, and the business value of an institution cascades across the city. It doesn't sit just within the institution. And we know that that's a value because we can see it across the world when there are major institutions. They provide such incredible value to the city. But it is also about offering the opportunity for people in their cities to say, I value this and I support it, and it doesn't need to be a business profit-making proposition per se, because the value is something far more profound, because these are our spirit houses, and that is invaluable.
Yeah.
One other item. At the Guggenheim Bilbao, the administration there monetizes the effect monthly on the city, which is a kind of interesting exercise. We don't do that in New York, but that's another way of thinking about your question.
And our bottom line is social benefit, not monetary benefit. And if our bottom line were monetary benefit, everything would cascade up very, very differently. And our job is a different job. And if we start to instrumentalize that, the output would become very different.
Richard, we're going to extend the Q&A for another 5 minutes.
All right, good. All right, so we have 6 minutes and 14 seconds.
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you very much to the panel. Though I would like to bring it back to audiences, and it seems to me thus far that much of the discussion has been predicated on audiences we already have. and also the audiences, that may be changing, but that are already coming through the door. And there is a very, very big discussion now also in Europe going on about relevance and also parts of our publics, of the demographic that we don't reach, but who might be willing to come. I'm not talking about the ones who will never, ever visit a museum, much like I will never visit a soccer game. But, there is an audience out there. There are young people out there, also of disenfranchised backgrounds, that we need to reach, but we may not have the right model right now in the museum, how we speak to our audiences, however much we give them a voice. But they may have just different experiences in terms of participatory forms of movement, dance, music that museums may not be. So my question to the panel is, what are we going to do? And are there any really cool ideas about how to go out there and really speak to and also bring in audiences that we are not bringing in yet in terms of relevance?
We made one big investment over the last 4 years, which was to invite artists in a social practice way to move the museum outside the walls to other places in the city. So we had an experiment where we took things around to 6 different sites in the city and engaged community. I think it's a relevant question. How do you get the almost ready to go in the museum people to show up? I want to make a pitch, though, that's slightly anti-millennial. The next biggest group in the world are people over 65.
Yes.
And many of them have time to actually take advantage of what we have to offer.
Yeah, and I think, working with many museums around the world too, I think that questions come up. And the first group of people we now talk to are the people that don't go to museums. You want to deepen the experience, but you also want to expand it. So by doing that, education is definitely a very strong piece of it. There's a lot of cultures in the world that the act of museum going is not in the natural family experience. People don't, when I was growing up in Thailand, my parents didn't take me to museums. It was an acquired taste to have to go and look at these things, and before that become, so there's a lot of humps we have to jump over. But by starting from, going back to, not that every museum is the same, but at least if you want to be relevant and really related to a larger cultural impact, which is, I think, it's what museums trying to do, is how do we be part of their lives in their own system. Not that you have to stop being yourself, but you can expand that and see what the Venn diagram would look like. I think that would be something that the engagement process, like what you say, starting from the shows and others, that I always thinking that a question is the best ambassador. Instead of thinking that you know the answer, by asking someone, they're already humbled by the act of being asked. And I think it's very important for us to do more in that museum practice.
There's been a lot of research done on how people are looking at museums as both social and cultural experiences. They go to museums to learn, but they also tend to see and to experience beautiful things. But they also go to museums to be with each other. Yeah. They use museums as a toolbox to triangulate with the people that they come in, with the people that they love or that they want to love, and they use it as a way to socialize. So I think, therefore, there are increasingly, we are not looking at our restaurants and our education spaces as amenities, but truly as an integral and holistic part of that experience. And that's, I think, what will bring people in. What will not bring people in is to continue the kind of traditional route of outreach that is kind of compensatory and apologetic. What will not bring people in is not to show up as a partner and not to be willing first to listen.
Yes, well, thank you very much for all your insightful testimonies. I'm 26, so I guess I'm a millennial. And I had a question. We are said to be, the millennials, we are said to want things to go fastly, and the world is going fast and it's changing fast, but it seems to be opposed to the rhythm of the museums, which seems to be very slow. So how do your institutions change and to answer to the rhythms? The world is going fast.
I think slowing down is fine.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Very rapidly, I heard many times say during the panel that people go to museums to be educated. maybe a smaller group of people go to the museum to experience art. And therefore, I think that the 50% of artist-driven part of a museum that Madeleine was talking about is, to a number of people, incredibly important. I would like to last mention what Richard Armstrong said, and the difficulty of the issue of donors. I'd like to remind people that the Cappella Scrovegni in Padova by Giotto is owed to moneylender, actually a usurer who was atoning and was still somehow grateful for the atonement. And we will apologize. I have to say that football is a 90 minutes performance, which is unexpected and not repeatable. And it's actually a fantastic spectacle.
One more? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Belize. I'm based in Saudi Arabia, working in an institution that just opened its doors to the public last year. But my question is for the institutions that have been around for decades. What might be the lessons that you're learning from the newer institutions that are entering the public space in this part of the world, in Asia, in regards to engaging new publics in shaping your institutions?
What makes me incredibly happily envious of my friends is the capacity to start from scratch, to deliver to a public a non-Western, non-European, grounded, centered art history. What's really exciting are the art histories that are being built that come from a kind of cleaner slate, if you will, not a clean slate altogether. But it thrills me. The intelligence that we're going to have in 10, 20 years in our population, thanks to new lenses provided by art and culture.
Let me add to that, because in an earlier panel a few days ago, someone talked about how unhappy he was seeing the same thing in museums around the world. Let me encourage you to be as powerfully connected to your locale as possible.
Yes.
And if people say that's eccentric, that's a good thing.
Yes.
Safe, please.
Is this on?
It's on. Just keep it close, please.
All right. Hi, my name is Saif. I wanted to respond when you guys were talking about the profitability and commercial viability of museums. It's not a question more than a comment, and I'm sure it's something that all of you have faced. I don't think Abu Dhabi woke up one day and said we want to spend billions of dollars on museums because we're going to turn a profit. But I do believe that there's an economic return. It improves the quality of life, and improves how attractive the city is for the creative class that wishes to migrate and anchor itself somewhere. And it does have a very strong effect on your ability to drive economic growth. So the ends are not only for creating a more amenable and attractive social fabric, but it also has a strong economic development role. But the thing that I want to highlight, it's not an easy feat. And that is why we're very fortunate to have partners such as the Guggenheim, such as the French Museums, and all of you as partners here with us today. It's because we know that it takes more than two to tango in this game, and it's only through this kind of collaboration that we can achieve a lot. So it's just throwing my...
Thank you. That's fantastic. We'd like to end it, and I'd like to end it on the C word here, if I may, copyright. I've asked that question before in an earlier panel, but museums are reconciling with the rights of reproducing, pieces of art, for commercial purposes. The challenges, and if you could share just a few thoughts.
Suhanya has a good point of view on that.
Moral rights of makers and artists are intrinsic to the work we do. We respect and have argued for that. Our relationship with artists regarding how those rights are used are individual and contract-based, and we hope about parity and recognition. There's global best practice, and we adhere to that. It's very important.
I would add to that Indonesia is probably not the place where best practice in terms of copyright has existed in the past, but definitely I would say that copyright is one of the few property rights that artists have and that they maintain throughout their practices, and I think it's important, along the lines of what Sahanya has said, is to respect that property right.
Fantastic.
I believe that, but I also think we have to be, as guardians of imagery, as free as possible.
Okay.
The question is, how possible is that?
And how free? Okay, sure, fantastic. Well, thank you. I mean,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank
you
you.
very much. Round of applause, please. Thank you very much for a very inspiring, fascinating panel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.